Angela Morrison was a woman of many faces, though few knew her beyond the surface. To the casual observer, she appeared as nothing more than a solitary figure, often seen walking the city streets late at night, her athletic frame wrapped in a simple hoodie and sweatpants. She exuded a calm presence, the kind of quiet confidence that could either put you at ease or make you wary. For Angela, these late-night walks weren't a mere routine. They were her way of finding balance in a world that often tipped too far into chaos. It was during these walks that she could momentarily escape the weight of her past, a past that most people would find unimaginable. Years ago, Angela had been one of the most formidable agents in an elite international counter-terrorism unit. Her job had taken her to places most people would never dare to venture, facing dangers that existed in the shadows of geopolitical conflicts. She had been a ghost, a force of nature trained to move undetected and strike with precision. Angela had saved lives, dismantled dangerous networks, and stood toe-to-toe with some of the most ruthless individuals on the planet. But for all her accomplishments, there was a darkness that loomed over her career, a singular moment that haunted her every step. A mission gone wrong. Civilians caught in the crossfire. Collateral damage, an antiseptic term for something far more devastating. It was this tragedy that had pushed her into early retirement, retreating into a life of anonymity and self-imposed solitude. Her new life was as unremarkable as it could be, by design. She had moved to a small, nondescript city where no one asked questions, took up work as a freelance security consultant, and spent her days quietly observing the world around her. Despite her attempts to blend in, Angela remained hyper-aware of her surroundings. Old habits die hard, and for someone like her, vigilance wasn't a choice, it was survival. Every street corner, every alley, every passerby was unconsciously catalogued and assessed. Most nights, her walks ended uneventfully. But tonight would be different. The city park was nearly deserted, the kind of place that most people avoided after sunset. The faint glow of old streetlights barely cut through the encroaching darkness, their flickering bulbs casting long, uneven shadows across the cracked pavement. Angela walked along the path, her steps deliberate yet unhurried. The crisp autumn air carried with it a chill that bit through her hoodie, but she didn't mind. The solitude was worth it. She paused briefly at an old wooden bench, her eyes scanning the park out of habit. A faint rustle in the bushes caught her attention, but when nothing emerged, she dismissed it as a squirrel or a stray cat. Settling onto the bench, she pulled out a well-worn paperback from her pocket, a philosophical treatise, heavy with ideas of justice and morality. The irony wasn't lost on her. Unbeknownst to Angela, someone else had noticed her presence. Officer Jack Strong sat in his patrol car at the edge of the park, the low hum of the engine filling the quiet night. Jack was the type of cop who prided himself on maintaining order, or at least his version of it. To his colleagues, he was a figure of authority, someone who got results, albeit with methods that often raised eyebrows. To the community, he was a man to be avoided, a bully in uniform who wielded his badge like a weapon. Tonight, Jack was in a particularly foul mood. A series of personal failures had compounded into a simmering rage that he couldn't shake. A lost bet, an argument with his estranged wife, and a reprimand from his supervisor earlier that day had left him feeling powerless. And Jack hated feeling powerless. When he spotted Angela sitting alone in the park, something in him snapped into focus. To him, she didn't belong there. Her dark skin, her athletic build, her calm demeanor, all of it grated against his instincts, which were less about enforcing the law and more about enforcing his dominance. In his mind, she was suspicious, though he couldn't articulate why. Maybe it was the way she seemed so at ease in a place he deemed unsafe. Or maybe it was the nagging sense of superiority that fueled his need to assert control. Whatever the reason, Jack decided she was worth his attention. Jack killed the engine and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel path as he approached. He carried himself with an air of authority, his hand resting casually on his belt near his holstered baton. Angela heard him before she saw him, her heightened senses alerting her to the rhythmic footfalls heading in her direction. She didn't look up immediately, instead finishing the sentence she was reading before tucking the book back into her pocket. When she finally raised her eyes, she met Jack's gaze with a calm, unflinching stare. "Evening," Jack said, his voice sharp and clipped. Angela nodded slightly. "Evening, officer." Jack studied her for a moment, his expression hardening. "You out here alone?" Angela tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Just taking a walk." "At this hour?" His tone carried an edge of accusation. Angela shrugged lightly. "It's a public park, isn't it?" Her response, calm and measured, only served to irritate Jack further. He took a step closer, his posture stiffening. "You got ID on you?" Angela raised an eyebrow, her face remaining neutral. "Am I being accused of something?" Jack's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he'd already decided was beneath him. This park's had some trouble lately. Vandalism, loitering, just making sure everything's in order. Angela's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though her eyes remained cold. "I see. Well, I can assure you, I'm neither vandalizing nor loitering, but thank you for your concern." The condescension in her voice, whether intentional or not, was the final straw. Jack's hand moved to the baton at his side, his fingers tightening around the handle. "Let me make something clear," he said, his voice low and menacing. "When I ask you for ID, you give it. Got it?" Blah. Angela stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She was slightly taller than Jack, and the realization seemed to unsettle him. She looked him directly in the eye, her expression unreadable. "Officer," she said evenly, "are you sure you want to do this?" The question hung in the air, its meaning ambiguous but undeniably challenging. Jack's grip on the baton tightened, his knuckles whitening. For a split second, a flicker of doubt crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by the seething anger that had been building all night. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back now. Jack Strong didn't know what it was about Angela Morrison that infuriated him so deeply. Perhaps it was the calmness in her tone, or the way she had risen to face him without a trace of fear. For someone like Jack, used to seeing people flinch under his authority, her unwavering confidence was a direct challenge to everything he believed about his own power. He wasn't going to walk away from this without proving who was in control. His grip on the baton tightened as he took another step forward, his presence looming larger as he tried to physically dominate the space between them. Angela, however, didn't move. She stood still, her hands at her sides, her posture relaxed but prepared. Her eyes followed his movements with clinical precision, taking in every detail, the slight tremor in his hand, the flare of his nostrils, the uneven rhythm of his breathing. She had seen men like Jack before many times. Bullies cloaked in authority, desperate to impose themselves on others to mask their own inadequacies. She could predict his next move before he even made it. "Turn around," Jack barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Hands where I can see them." Angela raised an eyebrow, tilting her head slightly as if considering the demand. "And why would I need to do that?" she asked, her voice measured, almost curious. Jack's patience snapped. "Because I said so," he growled, his baton now fully drawn. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Angela's lips twitched into the faintest semblance of a smile. It wasn't a smile of amusement, nor was it one of provocation. It was the kind of smile that suggested she was in control of the situation, even if Jack didn't realize it. "Officer," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I think we both know you're crossing a line here." The words hit Jack like a slap, though he refused to let it show. Crossing a line. Who was she to tell him that? He was the authority here. He was the one who decided what lines were drawn and when they were crossed. And yet, something about her tone so steady, so assured made his insides twist with doubt. But Jack Strong was not the kind of man to back down, especially not now with his pride on the line. "I'm not going to ask you again," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Turn around." "Now." Angela sighed softly, her gaze never wavering. She could see the tension in his stance, the barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface. He was a powder keg waiting to explode, and she knew exactly how to handle him. But this wasn't just about diffusing the situation, it was about making sure Jack understood that his actions had consequences. She had spent years dealing with people who believed they could impose their will on others without accountability, and she wasn't about to let that pattern continue here. Slowly, she raised her hands, palms open, a gesture of non-aggression. "All right, officer," she said, her tone almost placating. "If this is how you want to play it." Jack took it as a sign of submission, his chest puffing out slightly as he stepped closer. "That's more like it," he muttered, though his grip on the baton remained firm. He motioned with the baton for her to turn around, and Angela complied, pivoting slowly on her heel. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, giving him no reason to escalate further. As her back faced him, Jack allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. She was finally complying, finally falling in line. It was a small victory, but it was enough to soothe his bruised ego. He reached for his handcuffs, fully intending to detain her under the flimsiest of pretenses. In his mind, this was how authority worked. You didn't need justification when you had the power to enforce your will. But as he stepped closer, closing the distance between them, Angela spoke again. "You really should think this through," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Because once you make this move, there's no going back." Jack froze for a fraction of a second, the words cutting through his self-assured bravado. There was something about the way she said it calm, almost detached, that gave him pause. But his pride wouldn't let him reconsider. Instead, he scoffed, his grip tightening on the cuffs. "You don't get to tell me what to think," he snapped. "Hands behind your back. Now." Angela exhaled softly, as if she had expected nothing less. She slowly moved her hands behind her back, her movements fluid and unhurried. But just as Jack reached for her wrists, something changed. In one swift motion, Angela shifted her weight, pivoting on her heel to face him once more. Her hands shot up, and before Jack could react, she grabbed the baton he was holding, twisting it out of his grip with a precision that spoke of years of training. The suddenness of the move left Jack stunned, his body momentarily frozen as he tried to process what had just happened. Angela now held the baton in her hands, her grip firm and controlled. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Jack saw something in her gaze that made his stomach churn. It wasn't anger, nor was it fear. It was something far more disconcerting, absolute certainty. "Like I said," Angela murmured, her voice low and deliberate, "you really should have thought this through." Before Jack could recover, Angela snapped the baton in half with a single fluid motion. The sound of the wood cracking echoed through the park, a sharp, decisive noise that seemed to hang in the air. She let the broken pieces fall to the ground, her eyes never leaving Jack's. The look on his face was one of pure disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. What the hell, he started, but Angela cut him off. "You want to assert control," she said, her tone cool and unyielding. "You want to feel powerful, but all you've done is expose how little power you actually have." Jack's disbelief quickly morphed into anger, his face flushing red as he took a step back. "You think this is over?" He spat, his hand moving to his holster. "You just assaulted an officer." Angela tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanging. "Assault?" she echoed. "I think you'll find that I've been remarkably restrained." Jack didn't care. His hand closed around the grip of his firearm, his adrenaline-fueled rage clouding any semblance of rational thought. But before he could draw, Angela moved again, her speed and precision defying anything he had anticipated. In a blur of motion, she stepped into his space, her hand darting forward to grab his wrist. With a quick twist, she disarmed him, the gun clattering to the ground before he even realized what had happened. The pain in his wrist made him cry out, but Angela's grip remained firm. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "This is the part where you start listening," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Because if you don't, you're going to find out just how far out of your depth you really are." For the first time that night, Jack felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years: fear. Real, unrelenting fear. It gnawed at the edges of his bravado, threatening to consume him entirely. And as Angela released his wrist, letting him stumble back, he realized that he was no longer in control of this situation. She was. Angela stood motionless, her eyes locked onto Jack's as he staggered back, cradling his wrist in disbelief. The broken baton lay discarded on the ground between them, and Jack's firearm now sat a few feet away, gleaming under the dim park lights. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with tension, the kind that could only exist when someone's sense of invincibility had been shattered. Jack's mind raced, struggling to comprehend how the situation had turned so drastically against him. He had started this encounter fully confident in his authority, his training, and his ability to intimidate. Now, all of that seemed to have crumbled in an instant. Angela, on the other hand, was calm. Too calm. It was a quiet, unshakable confidence that Jack had never encountered before, and it unnerved him. She hadn't just disarmed him physically, she had stripped away the illusion of control he thought he held over her. For the first time in his career, he felt small, powerless, and exposed, and he hated it. But Jack was not the kind of man to admit defeat, even when it was glaringly obvious. His pride and anger were like twin fires, fueling his next move before reason could catch up. He lunged forward, his good hand reaching for the radio clipped to his chest. If he couldn't subdue her alone, he'd call for backup. Surely, with more officers on the scene, he could regain control of the narrative and paint Angela as the aggressor. It was a tactic he had used before. Overwhelm the target with numbers, manipulate the situation to his advantage, and write the reports in a way that left no room for doubt. But Angela was faster. Before his fingers could close around the radio, Angela stepped into his path, her movement fluid and deliberate. She didn't strike him, didn't shove him instead. She simply reached out and caught his wrist with a grip that was firm but not cruel. The restraint in her actions was deliberate, and Jack knew it. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She was trying to send a message: you don't get to escalate this. "I think very carefully about what you're about to do," Angela said, her voice low and steady. There was no malice in her tone, no hint of anger or hostility. If anything, it was the absence of those emotions that made her words so unsettling. Because once you call for backup, you're not the one writing the script anymore. Jack froze, his hand hovering inches from his radio. The weight of her words pressed down on him like a physical force. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. And deep down he knew she was right. If he brought more officers into this, it would no longer be his story to control. Questions would be asked. Reports would be scrutinized. And Angela, with her calm demeanor and precise actions, would make it very hard for him to spin the situation in his favor. His superiors had already been keeping a close eye on him after a string of complaints. Another incident, especially one that escalated like this, could very well be the end of his career. But Jack's pride wouldn't let him back down completely. With a sharp yank, he pulled his wrist free from her grip, stumbling back a few steps to put distance between them. His chest heaved as he glared at her, his mind still scrambling for a way to turn the tide. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Angela tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression that bordered on pity. "I'm not trying to walk away," she said simply. "I'm giving you a chance to de-escalate before you make things worse for yourself." The words hit Jack like a slap to the face. Worse for himself. The audacity of it made his blood boil. He was the one in charge here. He was the one who decided how this situation unfolded. And yet, with every passing second, Angela was making it increasingly clear that he was not in control. It was infuriating, humiliating even. But Jack was nothing if not stubborn. He wasn't going to let some random woman in a hoodie make a fool out of him. Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to steady his voice. "You assaulted an officer," he said, his tone sharp and accusing. "That's a felony. You're not walking away from this." Angela's eyes narrowed slightly, but her expression remained calm. "If you're going to accuse me of assault, you might want to take a good look at how we got here," she replied. "Because the only reason you're not lying on the ground right now is that I've chosen not to hurt you. That's not something you can say for yourself, is it?" The words stung, not because they were false, but because they were undeniably true. Jack had initiated the physical confrontation. He had drawn his baton, tried to assert his dominance, and had been thoroughly outmatched. Angela, on the other hand, had responded with precision and restraint. She hadn't escalated, she had neutralized. And deep down, Jack knew it. But admitting that was not an option. Not to her. Not to himself. He clenched his fists, his mind racing as he searched for anything that could give him the upper hand. His gaze flickered to the firearm lying a few feet away on the ground. If he could just get to it, he might be able to regain control. But Angela's eyes followed his, and she moved before he could act. In one smooth motion, Angela stepped forward and kicked the firearm farther away, sending it skidding across the pavement. The sound of metal scraping against concrete echoed through the park, and Jack's heart sank. His last hope of turning the situation in his favor had just been snatched away. "Let me make this very clear," Angela said, her voice cold and firm now. "I don't want to hurt you, but if you force my hand, I will end this in a way that you won't recover from, physically, professionally, or otherwise." The threat wasn't shouted. It wasn't delivered with anger or malice. It was calm, measured, and all the more terrifying because of it. Jack stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, fear, anger, humiliation. He had never felt so completely outmatched, so powerless, and yet there was a part of him that refused to give in. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he demanded, his voice rising in desperation. "I'm a police officer. You think anyone's going to believe you over me?" Angela's expression didn't change. If anything, she seemed almost bored by the question. "You keep telling yourself that," she said, her tone dismissive. But the truth is, you're not as untouchable as you think you are. Not anymore." The words struck a nerve. Jack felt his face flush with rage, his body trembling with the effort of holding himself together. He wanted to lash out, to scream, to do anything to reclaim the control he had lost. But every move he considered felt futile. Angela had stripped him of his weapons, his authority, and his sense of invincibility. He was completely and utterly at her mercy, and she knew it. For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence, the tension between them palpable. Jack's chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath, his mind racing in circles. Angela, meanwhile, remained perfectly still, her gaze steady and unyielding. She was waiting for what Jack didn't know. But the waiting was worse than any physical confrontation. It was as if she was giving him time to realize the full extent of his defeat. Finally, Angela broke the silence. "You have a choice to make," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You can walk away from this, take the loss, and think very carefully about the kind of man you want to be. Or you can keep pushing. And I promise you, it won't end well for you." Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to argue, to push back, to assert his authority one last time. But the weight of her words, combined with the crushing reality of his situation, left him with no fight left. For the first time in his career, Jack Strong realized he had no cards left to play. He had lost. And there was nothing he could do about it. Angela stood still, her posture relaxed but her presence commanding, as Jack wrestled internally with the weight of his humiliation. The tension between them hung heavy in the cold night air, and the stillness of the park amplified the sound of every shallow breath Jack took. Angela's words had pierced through the armor of his ego, leaving him defenseless in ways he wasn't accustomed to. Jack Strong was a man who thrived on control, on the ability to dictate outcomes with sheer force and intimidation. But now, stripped of his weapons and his authority, he felt the unfamiliar sting of powerlessness. It was a sensation he despised, and one he wasn't equipped to handle. For a long moment, Jack said nothing, his mind a chaotic swirl of anger, fear, and bruised pride. He stared at Angela, trying to gauge his next move, but she remained an enigma. Her steady gaze betrayed no emotion, no hint of weakness or hesitation. It was as if she was waiting for him to make a decision, silently daring him to step further into a conflict he couldn't win. And that only made his frustration grow. This woman, this stranger, had not only defied him but had completely unraveled his carefully constructed sense of authority. And worst of all, she had done it without breaking a sweat. "I'm giving you one last chance," Jack growled, his voice strained and uneven, betraying the desperation he tried to suppress. "If you walk away now, I might forget about this." Angela raised an eyebrow, her expression softening into something that resembled pity. "Forget about this," she repeated, her tone laced with incredulity. "You really think you're still in a position to offer deals?" The words stung, but Jack refused to let them show. He straightened his posture, forcing himself to stand taller, even though the weight of his humiliation threatened to crush him. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he snapped, his voice rising in volume as if sheer aggression could somehow tip the scales back in his favor. Angela tilted her head slightly, studying him as one might study a volatile but ultimately harmless animal. "You keep saying that," she replied calmly. "But the only thing I've seen tonight is a man desperately clinging to an illusion of power. And if that's who you really are, then I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Jack opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, a faint noise caught his attention. It was subtle at first, a barely audible rustling in the distance, but it quickly grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. Someone was approaching. Jack's heart leaped. a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. Back up. Maybe another officer had noticed his patrol car and come to investigate. For the first time since the encounter began, he felt the possibility of regaining control. Angela, too, heard the approaching footsteps, but her reaction was far different. She didn't flinch or turn toward the sound. Instead, her eyes remained locked on Jack, her expression as calm and composed as ever. If she was concerned about the arrival of another party, she didn't show it. In fact, the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips, as if she already knew what was coming. Moments later, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of the nearest street lamp. It wasn't another officer. It was a man in plain clothes, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his jacket. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. His face was partially obscured by the low brim of a baseball cap, but his eyes were sharp and focused as they surveyed the scene. Jack's initial burst of hope deflated almost instantly. He didn't recognize the man, but there was something about his presence that set him on edge. This wasn't a random passerby. There was an intentionality to the man's movements, a precision that reminded Jack of military training. Whoever he wasn't here by accident. The man stopped a few paces away, his gaze shifting briefly to Angela before settling on Jack. For a moment, he said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch uncomfortably between them. Then, in a voice that was calm but unmistakably firm, he spoke. "Looks like you're in a bit of a situation, officer." Jack bristled at the casual tone, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain a semblance of authority. "This is police business," he snapped. "You need to step back." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Police business?" he repeated, his tone almost amused. "From where I'm standing, it looks more like you're out of your depth." Angela's faint smile widened ever so slightly, though she remained silent, letting the man's words hang in the air. Jack's face flushed with anger, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this stranger was not someone to be trifled with. There was an intensity to the man's gaze, a quiet confidence that rivaled Angela's. For the first time, Jack felt as though he was standing between two immovable forces, and the realization made his stomach churn. "I don't know who you are," Jack said through gritted teeth, "but you need to leave. Now." The man didn't move. Instead, he slowly pulled his hands from his pockets, revealing empty palms, a gesture meant to convey that he wasn't a threat. But the deliberate nature of his movements only served to heighten Jack's unease. "You don't need to know who I am," the man said evenly. "What you need to know is that I've been watching this whole thing, and I don't like what I've seen." Jack's eyes widened, a cold knot of fear tightening in his chest. "You've been watching," he echoed, his voice faltering slightly. The man nodded. "From the moment you pulled her over, I've been watching. And trust me, officer, this isn't going to end the way you think it will." Jack's mind raced. If this man had been watching the entire encounter, then he had witnessed everything: the threats, the escalation, the loss of control. The realization sent a jolt of panic through him, but before he could formulate a response, Angela finally spoke. "I told you," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Once you made the choice to escalate, you lost control of the narrative." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Jack felt the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had underestimated her from the beginning, dismissed her as just another civilian he could intimidate into submission. But Angela was no ordinary woman. She had dismantled him piece by piece, stripping away his authority until all that remained was a man exposed for what he truly was, a bully with no substance to back him up. The man in the baseball cap took a step closer, his voice lowering but no less firm. "You've got a decision to make, officer. You can keep digging this hole you're in, or you can start figuring out how to climb out of it." Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. The weight of the situation was suffocating, and for the first time he felt the stirrings of genuine regret. But his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. Not yet. He clenched his fists, his gaze darting between Angela and the stranger, searching for some way to salvage his dignity. But there was no way out, and deep down he knew it. Angela stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. "This is your last chance," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "Walk away. Take whatever's left of your pride and go. Because if you don't, you're going to lose a lot more than just this fight." Jack stared at her, his chest heaving as he struggled to suppress the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Anger, humiliation, fear, they all churned within him, leaving him paralyzed. He wanted to fight back, to assert his authority one last time, but the futility of it was glaringly obvious. The man in the baseball cap crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "Clock's ticking, officer," he said. "Make your choice." And for the first time in his career, Jack Strong realized he had no choice at all. Jack stood frozen, the weight of his humiliation anchoring him to the ground. Every instinct in him screamed to act, to do something that would reclaim his shattered authority, but he couldn't. The balance of power had shifted completely, leaving him stranded in a reality he couldn't control. Angela's unflinching gaze bore into him, and the man in the baseball cap, still an enigma, stood as a silent sentinel, amplifying Jack's vulnerability. The stillness was suffocating, punctuated only by the faint rustle of leaves in the park and the distant hum of traffic. But beneath the surface, the tension was volcanic, ready to erupt at any moment. Angela was the first to break the silence. Her voice was low and steady, carrying an authority that dwarfed the badge Jack had relied on for so long. "You're still standing here," she said, almost as though observing a curious anomaly. "Which tells me you haven't learned your lesson yet." Jack's jaw tightened, his pride rearing its head despite the overwhelming evidence of his defeat. He wasn't a man who knew how to admit he was wrong, especially not in a situation like this. The shame coursing through him burned like acid, and the only way he knew to douse it was through defiance. "You don't get to lecture me," he spat, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You don't know who I am, what I've done, what I'm capable of." Angela didn't flinch. Her expression remained unreadable, a mixture of calm detachment and something Jack couldn't quite place. Was it pity? Disdain? Whatever it was, it infuriated him. "What you're capable of," she repeated, as if tasting the words. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Let me show you what I'm capable of." Before Jack could process the meaning behind her words, Angela moved. It wasn't a strike or an attack, not yet. She stepped forward, closing the space between them with a fluidity that unnerved him. Jack instinctively stepped back, his boots scraping against the pavement. His mind screamed at him to hold his ground, but his body betrayed him, retreating under the weight of her presence. She was in control, and they both knew it. Angela's voice softened, but the steel in her tone was unmistakable. "Do you know what men like you rely on?" she asked, her words deliberate and precise. "Fear. You need people to fear you because without it, you're nothing. No authority, no respect, just a man hiding behind a uniform." Jack's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as her words struck home. "That's not true," he hissed, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the conviction he lacked. "I enforce the law. I protect people." Angela's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "Protect people? she echoed, her tone dripping with skepticism. Is that what you call this? She gestured vaguely to the broken baton on the ground, the scuffed pavement where his gun had landed, and the invisible weight of his actions hanging in the air. You weren't protecting anyone tonight. You were trying to protect your ego. The accusation landed like a blow, and Jack felt his chest tighten as a fresh wave of anger surged through him. But before he could retort, the man in the baseball cap spoke for the first time in minutes, his voice calm but cutting. She's right, you know. Men like you don't protect, they project. Your fears, your insecurities, your anger. You use that badge as a shield, but it's not protecting anyone, least of all you. Jack whirled on the man, his face flushed with rage. Who the hell are you to talk to me like that? He snarled, his voice cracking. You think you're better than me? You think you know what it's like to do this job, to deal with the shit I deal with every day? The man didn't flinch. If anything, his expression hardened, his sharp eyes locking onto Jack's like a predator sizing up its prey. I know exactly what it's like, he said, his voice steady. More than you ever will. Jack blinked, thrown off balance by the statement. His gaze darted to Angela, as if searching for confirmation, but her expression remained impassive. Who was this man? What was his connection to her? And why did he feel like the ground was shifting beneath his feet with every word that came out of his mouth? Angela took another step closer, her presence demanding Jack's attention once more. Let me make this simple for you, she said, her voice cutting through the fog of his confusion. You have two choices. You can walk away right now and maybe, just maybe, salvage what little is left of your reputation. Or you can keep pushing. And I'll show you exactly what happens when a man like you meets someone who isn't afraid of him. Jack's pride screamed at him to fight back, to assert himself, to reclaim the control he had lost. But the cold, hard truth was staring him in the face. He was outmatched. Angela wasn't just physically stronger or more skilled, she was smarter, calmer, and completely unafraid. And the man in the baseball cap, whoever he was, only added to the imbalance of power. Jack was alone, and he knew it. But his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He reached for his radio. If he couldn't win this fight alone, he'd bring in reinforcements. Backup would change the dynamics, tilt the scales back in his favor. At least, that's what he told himself. The moment his hand moved toward the radio, Angela's demeanor shifted. Her calm expression hardened, and her voice dropped to a tone that sent chills down Jack's spine. Don't, she said, the single word laced with an authority that froze him mid-motion. Jack hesitated, his hand hovering inches from the radio. Angela took another step forward, and the man in the baseball cap moved in tandem, flanking her like a silent guardian. The two of them radiated a presence that was impossible to ignore, a combined force that seemed to sap the air from Jack's lungs. Call for backup if you want, Angela continued, her voice steady but firm. But understand this, the more people you bring into this, the more witnesses there will be to your failure. And when the truth comes out, you'll be left with nothing. Jack's mind raced, torn between his desperate need to regain control and the undeniable logic of her words. He could call for backup, escalate the situation further, and hope for the best. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't end the way he wanted. Angela wasn't bluffing. She had the upper hand, and any attempt to fight back would only dig him deeper into the hole he had already created. For a long moment, Jack stood frozen, his hand trembling as it hovered near the radio. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving with the effort of holding himself together. He felt the weight of Angela's gaze, the silent judgment of the man in the baseball cap, and the crushing reality of his own inadequacy. And for the first time in his life, he felt the unmistakable sting of defeat. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Jack lowered his hand, letting it fall limp at his side. The motion felt like surrender, and the shame of it burned in his chest. He couldn't bring himself to look at Angela, couldn't bear to see the triumph in her eyes. Instead, he stared at the ground, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Angela watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a faint sigh, she stepped back, giving him space to retreat. "You made the right choice," she said quietly, though there was no trace of sympathy in her tone. "Now leave." Jack didn't need to be told twice. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched and his pride shattered. The sound of his boots scraping against the pavement echoed through the park, a hollow reminder of the man he had tried to be and failed. And as he disappeared into the darkness, Angela stood silently, her gaze steady and unyielding. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind would linger long after the night had ended. As Jack's footsteps faded into the darkness, Angela remained rooted in place, her posture unmoving as she watched him retreat. The silence of the park returned, heavy and palpable, as if the world itself was holding its breath. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax, her shoulders lowering slightly as the tension ebbed away. But her mind stayed sharp. This wasn't over, not yet. Men like Jack didn't simply vanish into the night. They regrouped, they retaliated, and they struck again when they thought the moment was right. Angela knew this wasn't just about a bruised ego. For someone like Jack, it was about survival in a system that thrived on power. And tonight, his power had been stripped bare. The man in the baseball cap stepped closer, his calm presence filling the void left by Jack's departure. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch between them. When he finally did, his voice was low, almost conversational. "He'll come back. Men like him always do." Angela turned her gaze to the man, studying him for a moment before nodding. "I know," she replied simply. Her tone was even, but there was a flicker of something deeper beneath it, resolve, perhaps, or the faintest trace of weariness. "That's why I'm not leaving yet." The man tilted his head slightly, as if reassessing her. "You handled that well," he said after a moment. "Most people would have either fought him outright or backed down entirely. You did neither." Angela allowed a faint smile to tug at the corner of her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I've had practice," she said, her voice laced with a quiet irony. "This isn't my first encounter with a man who thinks a badge makes him invincible." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Still," he said, "you've made an enemy tonight. He's not the kind to let this go. You know that, right?" Angela's gaze shifted briefly to the spot where Jack had stood, the shattered baton still lying on the ground as a silent testament to the confrontation. "I know," she said softly. "But I didn't have a choice." The man raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in his sharp eyes. "No choice?" he echoed. "You could have walked away." "You didn't." Angela's expression hardened slightly, her jaw tightening as she met his gaze. "Walking away wouldn't have stopped him," she said firmly. "It never does. Men like that, they don't learn until someone forces them to." There was a weight to her words, a conviction that spoke of experience and hard-earned knowledge. The man seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding again, his approval subtle but unmistakable. "Fair enough," he said. "But you know as well as I do, this doesn't end here." Angela's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm counting on it." As if on cue, a faint noise broke through the stillness of the park. The sound of an engine, low and rumbling, growing louder with each passing second. Angela turned her head toward the source, her posture straightening as her senses sharpened. The man followed her gaze, his expression darkening as the headlights of a vehicle came into view, cutting through the shadows like twin blades of light. Jack was back, but he wasn't alone. The patrol car pulled to a stop at the edge of the park, its engine idling as two figures stepped out. Jack emerged first, his face twisted into a mask of barely contained fury. His earlier defeat hung around him like a storm cloud, fueling every heavy step he took toward Angela. Behind him was another officer, older and broader, with a grim expression that suggested he wasn't here to play games. Angela's eyes flicked to the older man's badge sergeant. She recognized the calculated determination in his movements. This wasn't just about ego anymore. Jack had called in reinforcements, and now it was about saving face. The sergeant spoke first, his voice carrying the kind of weight that demanded attention. "Ma'am," he said, his tone cold but professional, "we've received a report of an altercation in this park involving an officer. I need you to explain what happened." Angela didn't flinch. She met his gaze with the same unyielding composure she had shown Jack, her voice steady and clear. "Your officer attacked me," she said plainly. "I defended myself." Jack let out a derisive snort, his face reddening with anger. "Defended yourself," he spat. "You disarmed me. You assaulted me." Angela turned her gaze to Jack, her expression calm but laced with quiet authority. "You drew your baton and tried to strike me," she said evenly. "Everything that happened after that was your choice." The sergeant held up a hand, silencing Jack before he could respond. "Enough," he said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. He turned his attention back to Angela, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Is there anyone who can corroborate your story?" Before Angela could answer, the man in the baseball cap stepped forward. His presence seemed to shift the dynamic instantly, his calm yet commanding demeanor drawing the sergeant's attention. "I can," the man said simply. "I saw the whole thing." The sergeant's gaze flicked to the man, assessing him with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with countless witnesses. "And you are?" The man reached into his jacket and produced an ID, holding it up for the sergeant to see. Whatever was on the card made the sergeant's expression falter for the briefest moment before he schooled his features into neutrality. "Agent Michael Hayes," the man said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Homeland Security." Jack's face paled, the color draining from his skin as the weight of the revelation sank in. This wasn't just some random bystander. This was a federal agent. And he had seen everything. The sergeant's jaw tightened, the lines around his mouth deepening as he processed the situation. "Agent Hayes," he said carefully, his tone betraying a hint of unease. "You're saying you witnessed this entire incident?" Hayes nodded, slipping his ID back into his jacket. "From start to finish," he said. "Your officer initiated the altercation," she responded appropriately. Jack's mouth opened, a protest forming on his lips, but the sergeant shot him a warning look that silenced him instantly. The power dynamic had shifted once again, and this time Jack was on the losing side. The sergeant turned back to Angela, his expression grim. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I'm going to need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement." Angela crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "Am I being detained?" The sergeant hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he shook his head. "No," he admitted reluctantly, "but I strongly recommend you cooperate." Angela didn't respond immediately. She glanced at Hayes, who gave her a subtle nod, then back at the sergeant. "Fine," she said. "I'll cooperate. But only if he," she gestured to Jack, "is held accountable for what he did tonight." The sergeant's lips thinned into a hard line, his displeasure evident. "We'll investigate the matter," he said curtly. Angela's eyes narrowed. See that you do. The tension between them lingered for a moment longer before the sergeant turned on his heel, motioning for Jack to follow. Jack hesitated, his gaze darting between Angela and Hayes, before reluctantly trailing after his superior. The sound of their footsteps faded into the night, leaving Angela and Hayes alone once more. Hayes turned to Angela, his expression softening slightly. You handled that well, he said. Better than most would have. Angela exhaled softly, the weight of the night finally settling on her shoulders. It's not over, she said quietly. Men like him don't let things go. Hayes nodded, his gaze thoughtful. No, he agreed. But neither do people like you. The silence of the park felt heavier now, like the lingering weight of a storm that had passed but left its mark. Angela stood still, her gaze fixed on the path where Jack and his sergeant had disappeared. The adrenaline coursing through her veins had begun to ebb, leaving behind a familiar exhaustion. The events of the night had played out as she had expected, yet the aftermath still carried its own complexities. Men like Jack Strong didn't fade into the background after a loss. They plotted, they retaliated, and they found ways to twist the narrative. Angela knew this wasn't the end of the fight, it was merely the beginning of a longer war. Michael Hayes adjusted the brim of his baseball cap, his presence grounding and steady. He didn't speak immediately, allowing Angela the space to process what had happened. He had learned, through years of observation and experience, when silence was more valuable than words. Angela appreciated it, though she didn't acknowledge it outright. Instead, she finally exhaled breath she hadn't realized she was holding and turned to face him. You didn't have to step in, she said, her voice calm but laced with quiet gratitude. I had it under control. Hayes gave a slight shrug, his sharp eyes scanning the surrounding park as if searching for lingering threats. Maybe you did, he said evenly. But sometimes it helps to have an extra set of eyes, especially when the stakes are this high. Angela raised an eyebrow, studying him for a moment. She didn't trust easily, but there was something about Hayes that felt genuine. His demeanor was too measured, his words too precise to be anything other than intentional. He hadn't intervened for show, he had calculated his move with the same precision she had used to disarm Jack. Still, she wasn't ready to lower her guard completely. And what exactly are the stakes? She asked, her tone probing. You're not here by coincidence. Hayes met her gaze, his expression unflinching. No, he admitted. I've been watching Officer Strong for a while now. He's not just a bully, he's part of a larger problem. There's a pattern to his behavior, and tonight was just another link in a long chain of abuse. Angela's eyes narrowed slightly. You could have stepped in sooner. Hayes nodded, as if acknowledging her point. I could have, he said, but sometimes people need to see the truth play out for themselves. If I'd intervened too early, it would have been his word against mine. But now, he's exposed. And with a witness like you, his options just got a lot narrower. Angela let the words settle for a moment before responding. So this wasn't about protecting me. It was about building your case. Hayes didn't flinch at the accusation. It was about both, he said simply. You didn't need my protection. That much was clear. But you've also become a key piece of something much bigger than one bad cop. Angela's jaw tightened, the implications of his words sinking in. She had spent years trying to distance herself from battles like this, stepping away from the world of power struggles and systemic corruption. But no matter how far she tried to run, it always seemed to find her again. Tonight had been proof of that. So what happens now? She asked, her voice steady but edged with caution. Hayes glanced toward the park's exit, his expression thoughtful. Now we let the wheels turn. Jack Strong's temper will be his undoing. He'll push back, make noise, maybe even try to cover his tracks. But the more he fights, the deeper he'll dig himself into a hole. And when the time comes, we'll be ready to bury him." Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. "We?" Hayes gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You think I'm the only one watching him? There are more people like me, people who've been tracking patterns like his for years. Strong's not an isolated case, he's a symptom of something much larger. And if you're willing, you could be a part of taking that system down." Angela's instinct was to recoil, to reject the idea outright. She had spent too long fighting battles that left her scarred and weary, only to see the systems she fought against adapt and survive. The idea of stepping back into that world, of aligning herself with another organization, felt like inviting old ghosts to haunt her again. But Hayes' words struck a chord. Deep down, she knew he was right. Jack Strong wasn't the disease, he was just one of many symptoms. And ignoring the problem wouldn't make it go away. "I'm not looking to join a crusade," she said finally, her tone measured. "I've done my time in that world. It doesn't end well." Hayes nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not asking for a crusade," he said. "Just think of it as finishing what you started tonight. You've already taken the first step." Angela didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let her gaze drift to the broken baton still lying on the ground, a stark reminder of the confrontation that had unfolded. Hayes was right, she had taken the first step. And whether she liked it or not, that step had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. After a long pause, she turned back to Hayes, her expression guarded but resolute. "I'll think about it." Hayes gave a small nod, seeming to accept her answer for now. "That's all I'm asking," he said. Then, with a glance toward the darkened path where Jack had disappeared, he added, "Stay sharp. He's not done with you yet." Angela gave a faint nod, her mind already racing through the possibilities. She had no doubt Jack would retaliate, men like him always did. But she wasn't the same person she had been when she walked into the park tonight. Something had shifted, a spark reignited in her that she had thought long extinguished. She wouldn't seek the fight, but she wouldn't shy away from it either. As Hayes turned to leave, his footsteps fading into the shadows, Angela stood alone once more. The park was silent again, the night settling back into its familiar rhythm. But for Angela, there was no going back to the quiet life she had tried to carve out for herself. Tonight had been a turning point, one she hadn't seen coming but couldn't ignore. She bent down, picking up the broken halves of the baton. The wood was splintered and jagged, a fitting metaphor for the system it represented. As she held the pieces in her hands, a quiet resolve settled over her. Jack Strong might not be done with her, but more importantly, she wasn't done with him or the system that had enabled him. Angela turned toward the park's exit, her steps deliberate and steady. The fight wasn't over, but this time she wouldn't be fighting for survival. She would be fighting for something bigger, something that mattered, and she wouldn't be fighting alone.